Hearing is a cumulative effect of the sound waves passing via external acoustic meatus, via the ossicles in the middle ear, through the cochlea and the auditory nerve to reach the brain, where they get interpreted so that we can hear the sound. It can be divided into three compartments: the conductive part, which includes your external auditory meatus and your ossicles or your middle ear; the sensory part, which includes your cochlea; and the neural part, which includes your auditory nerve. And deafness is the defect in either one of the compartments, or sometimes more than one compartment. So like I said, deafness is one abnormal compartment and two normal compartments. So when we have a defect that lies in the external auditory ear or in the middle ear, we call it conductive deafness, which is a mild deafness of about 15 decibels. So you can see the patient will hear at around 40 decibels. When the cochlea is affected, it's called sensory deafness, which is a severe deafness of about 35 decibels, and the patient will start hearing at about 60 decibels. And when your nerve, auditory nerve, gets affected, it's a very severe deafness of about 55 decibels, and the patient will start hearing at about 80 decibels. In a pure tone audiometry, when we plot on an audiogram, we plot air conduction and bone conduction graphs. Air conduction will include your sound waves passing via your external auditory meatus and via your ear ossicles. Your bone conduction includes sound vibrations passing via your skull, which stimulate your cochlea and your nerve. So bone conduction basically bypasses the air conduction. The sound waves directly pass or directly transmit as the vibrations via the skull and stimulate the cochlea. The air conduction is bypassed. In a conductive deafness, when we plot it on an audiogram, we know in a conductive deafness, we have the defect is going to lie in the external ear or in the middle ear. So the air conduction graph is going to be above 25 decibels. Deafness is what we saw, the cutoff is 25 decibels. So when the patient hears above 25 decibels, it's deafness. So since the defect lies in your conductive part, the air conduction graph is going to go above 25 decibels, and like we saw, usually air conduction has a mild deafness of about 15 decibels. So the patient will hear at about 40 decibels. So the air conduction graph goes at about, or is plotted at about 40 decibels. Whereas the bone conduction bypasses this air conduction and directly stimulates the cochlea or the auditory nerve. The cochlea and the auditory nerve are normal in case of a conductive deafness. Thus the bone conduction is normal, and normal hearing is below 25 decibels. So the bone conduction graph gets plotted at below 25 decibels. And thus in conductive deafness we have a air-bone gap, since the air conduction graph is plotted above 25 decibels at about 40 decibels, and the bone conduction graph gets plotted below 25 decibels. So we have a air-bone gap of about more than 20 decibels in case of conductive hearing loss. In case of a sensory neural loss, what happens is, since your cochlea or your nerve is the one that is affected in a sensory neural loss, your bone conduction is above 25 decibels. And like we saw, it's a severe or a very severe deafness. So the bone conduction graph gets plotted at about 60 decibels or 80 decibels, depending upon whether it's a sensory loss or a neural loss. Now, why is the bone air conduction in case of a sensory neural loss above 25 decibels? That's because the sound waves have to travel via the external ear, the middle ear, and ultimately stimulate the cochlea or the auditory nerve. And since here the defect lies in the cochlea or in the auditory nerve, even if the sound waves can travel normally through the external ear and the middle ear, they cannot stimulate the cochlea or the auditory nerve, since the defect lies at the sensory neural level. Thus, any sound wave which is below 60 decibels or below 80 decibels, though can get transmitted without a problem via the external ear, but since it cannot stimulate the cochlea or the or the auditory nerve, it does not ultimately reach the brain to get interpreted as a sound, and thus the air conduction also is plotted above 25 decibels, and thus there will be no airborne gap in case of a sensory neural hearing loss.